Great. So the recording is on. So you all are aware. Welcome everyone to the Energy Facility Siting Council's Wildfire Prevention and Response Rulemaking Workshop. My name is Chris Clark. I'm the council's rules coordinator, and I'm a policy analyst here with the department. I'm sure we'll have a few more people trickling in. But to go over what we're going to talk about today, I will provide a quick overview of how this workshop's going to work. I think we're up to about 20 folks now, so I might not do a full round of introductions, but I'll always have department staff introduce themselves. And then we'll provide a little background and policy context on this rulemaking before we jump into our real policy discussions. We've identified a number of issues there to discuss with you all today, and we're hoping to get your feedback on. So we'll go through those one by one before we wrap up and talk about next steps for this rulemaking and kind of the bigger rulemaking timeline for what we're on. Can I just get a quick, Sarah, maybe can you give me a head nod? Are my slides advancing and you can see the slideshow? Okay, great. Okay, so as a couple of ground rules for the workshop today, we're welcoming participation from anybody who's on the call, but to have people avoid talking over one another, we do ask that you please raise your hand and wait to be called on before making comments. And then we'd also ask you to keep yourself on mute until you are called on. To raise your hand, there's a little reactions button that should be in the upper right-hand part of your screen. And there should be a little hand icon which you can use to raise and lower your hand. And then to mute yourself, you can use the little microphone icon, which is at the top of my screen. So that's probably at the top of your screen too. You can also use Control-Shift-M to mute and unmute yourself. It looks like we do have a couple of folks on the phone. So to raise and lower your hand on the phone, you can press *5 on your dial pad, and to mute and unmute yourself, you can use *6. If anybody wants to try out those controls now, just to make sure you got it, please go ahead. If it's not working, go ahead and just let me know right now. Okay, and as I mentioned, great, looks like some of the phones are working there for raising and lowering hands. Yeah, and whoever's calling in from the 559 number, it looks like you got it. You just have to hit *5 again to lower your hand when you're done as well, which I know you may not be able to see what I am seeing, so. Because that's not. So with that, I guess anybody that's on the webinar that would like to introduce themselves, feel free to throw something in the chat. The chat is enabled for this, I believe. And then I'll go ahead and have Todd Cornett introduce himself.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Todd Cornett. I'm the Assistant Director for Siting at the Department of Energy, and so I manage the Energy Facility Siting Division, and I'm also the Council Secretary staffing the Energy Facility Siting Council, and happy to see that Councilmember Cindy Condon is on the line as well, so we appreciate you joining, and just want to say thanks for participating. Like all of our rulemakings, we want to hear from the varied interests, and it really helps us when we're trying to figure out what kind of rules we want to recommend to council, and we're very much at a very early stage with this rulemaking. So your input and insights are very much appreciated. So once again, thank you for your time.
Great. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yes, thank you very much. My name is Sarah Esterson. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor with the Siting Division. And I've only been in this role for a little over a year, but I largely work very closely with our senior analysts and their application and amendment review, and as closely as possible with Chris in rulemaking and with our compliance program. So I'm happy to be here and happy to see the participation.
Thanks, Sarah. And I won't have everybody go through, but I do want to just point out, it looks like we have a few staff members from the Oregon Public Utility Commission. So thank you all for attending today. We'll be talking a lot about rulemaking that they're conducting during this workshop today. And we're really happy to have you here as both a technical resource and just have some good experience working in this space for a while now. It looks like we also have a lot of folks joining us from the utilities themselves and some interested members of the public. So thank you everyone for being here today. I saw that a few more people on the phone joined us since I gave the instructions. And so I did just want to go over one more time. If you're on the phone, we are just asking folks to raise their hand before they make comments when we get to the comment phase. You can do that on the phone by pressing *5 on your dial pad, and then you can mute and unmute yourself pressing *6. And I am getting a little background noise, so I'm going to go ahead and mute you now. And I just want to let you know, if you mute your phone, you may have to both unmute your phone and unmute yourself from the webinar. So a little complicated, but hopefully we'll get through this all together. Okay, and whoever is calling in from the 503-559 number, I do see that your hand is still up. So if you want to make a comment or have a question, go ahead. I can actually unmute you for a second.
Yeah, Chris, I believe that's Councilmember Condon.
Okay, that's Councilmember Condon. Well, welcome, Councilmember Condon. You are free to unmute yourself. I actually don't believe that I can unmute you. So again, yeah, if you have a comment at any time, please *6. Oh, there you are.
So thank you, Chris. How do I lower my hand?
Oh, it's just *5 again.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. That's I just didn't know how to lower it. Thank you.
And I actually had to look up the controls for the dial pad today myself. So I did also find out that if you are on the phone and you press *1 with your dial pad, it'll tell you whatever controls you have available to you if you need a refresher, which if you are anything like me, you may. So, and then just one more time, since we've had a few more people jump on, you should be aware that this meeting is being recorded. We will make the recording of both the video and the audio available available as soon as we have them, and those will be put up on the council's rulemaking website. Okay. So before we get started, I wanted to give just a little bit of background on the overall policy context of what's been going on with wildfire in Oregon. As many of you may know, in early 2019, Governor Brown signed an executive order creating a council on wildfire response to review Oregon's current model for wildfire prevention, preparedness, and response, and provide recommendations to strengthen, improve, and replace existing systems. One of the recommendations that came out of that council was to pursue new legislation to require wildfire plans for Oregon's Oregon's electric transmission system. A bill for that was proposed in 2020, but didn't pass. And the governor subsequently included a mandate to the Public Utility Commission to evaluate electric companies' wildfire protection plans in her Executive Order 2004 in 2020. And so the PUC opened a rulemaking docket related to wildfire risk mitigation in August of 2020. And that process has included a lot of pretty extensive stakeholder engagement through various work groups on wildfire-related topics. As that rulemaking was going on, Senate Bill 762 passed during the 2021 legislative session. And that bill, among other things, established new standards for electric utility wildfire protection plans. Also included statewide risk analysis and some other wildfire mitigation efforts. So the PUC adopted their initial set of permanent rules for wildfire protection plans in December of last year, and they're continuing to work on supplemental rulemaking to flesh out some of the more specific requirements. Oregon's 3 investor-owned utilities submitted their 2022 wildfire protection plans to the PUC, and got to see that we have representatives from, I think, all 3 with us today. And the review and evaluation of those plans are ongoing at an additional PUC docket. While this has been going on, the council has been hearing increased concern about wildfire at energy facility sites, and we've been hearing more comments about addressing and mitigating wildfire risk in the siting process. Part of what's driving those comments and the overall policy context is the increased frequency and severity of wildfire in Oregon and across the West, which is caused in part by the effects of climate change. So this is kind of an issue that we know is bad now and probably going to continue to get worse over time, which is part of the reason we want to address it now. We know at least some fires have been ignited or made worse by electric infrastructure. For example, the 2018 Camp Fire near Paradise, California, was determined by CAL FIRE investigators to have been caused by a faulty transmission line owned by Pacific Gas and Electric Company. There's been some other incidences of electric utility cause or related fire here in Oregon, although I do want to point out that there haven't been any major fire incidents at EFSC jurisdictional facilities. We have had some minor incidents reported to us at facilities, and there have also been some documented cases of fires at renewable energy facilities. So the picture on this slide shows a 2018 fire in Gillum County that was started after a nacelle caught fire at a turbine tower at a non-EFSC jurisdictional facility. There's also been a few incidents of fires caused by wildfire or wildlife contact or contact with vegetation at the Gentile lines that connect generating facilities to the bulk transmission grid. So that's sort of the overall context that we're working in. There's been this increased visibility of wildfire, and that has led to a increased interest in just making sure that wildfire risk is appropriately analyzed, addressed, and mitigated during the siting process. And luckily, Sarah is going to talk a little bit about how we've been doing that so far and what some of the strengths and weaknesses of our current rules are.
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, again, my name is Sarah Esterson, and I'm just going to walk you through a slide or two. So we wanted to highlight existing council standards where there has been or could be an evaluation of fire and/or fire risk depending on the facility. We've presented those here. So First, under the organizational expertise standard, the council's obligated to find in part that an applicant has demonstrated an ability to design, construct, and operate the facility in a manner that protects public health and safety. And so it's that public health and safety trigger that in some instances we see some discussion of fire risk from an energy facility. And then the second standard that's presented here is the council's public services standard, where just for reference, that standard requires council to find that an applicant can build a proposed facility so they can construct and operate it, and it would not be likely to result in a significant adverse impact to the ability of a public or private service provider to provide fire protection services. And then, of course, that evaluation typically goes out about 10 miles from the site boundary of an energy facility. So you can go to the next slide. So consistent with those two standards that we just walked you through, we wanted to outline the associated exhibits that are associated with those standards. And an exhibit is submitted with an application for site certificate or a request for amendment. And in some instances, those exhibits have information related to facility fire risk. These exhibits, starting in the order we've presented here, include Exhibit D. Exhibit D goes with organizational expertise, and then there's Exhibit K that goes with land use. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then Exhibit U, which goes with public services. So specific examples, what we're seeing in Exhibit D is if a proposed facility includes a lithium-ion battery energy storage, we're typically seeing acknowledgement of some level of fire risk from dangerous heat evolution or thermal runaway. And so a developer might present that to minimize that risk, that the transporter of lithium-ion batteries would adhere to federal requirements. So there's a little bit of an evaluation there. And then in Exhibit K, what we've seen is that if a proposed facility is located within a local jurisdiction that has adopted code provisions that are specific to fire mitigation or a development standard that's specific to fire risk, then those code provisions would be evaluated in Exhibit K. And some examples that we've seen are in Josephine County and Wasco County, where they in fact had some fire-related zone provisions that were incorporated. And so we saw an analysis there. And then lastly, in Exhibit U, there's an evaluation of construction and operation of a facility. And so we typically see an evaluation of construction-related fire risk and measures and how that would minimize impact to fire service providers. And then for operational fire risk, it's really been largely limited to whether the facility is within an existing service provider's territory. And if it is, then that's largely where the impact is left. And if it's not in a service provider territory, then we might see, some plan for how to work with a service provider, a fire protection service provider, to ensure that there's coverage in that area. But rarely, if ever, is there any type of wildfire risk assessment under that exhibit for that standard. And then we didn't include it here because it's not related to a standard, but wanted to acknowledge that Exhibit B, which is the project description, does have an information requirement to identify fire systems and equipment for the proposed facility, but council isn't obligated to make a finding on Exhibit B. So our intent here is to show you the the places within an application that we have seen some information about fire and fire systems. But certainly none of these provide a clear nexus to help the department or applicants evaluate, clearly evaluate fire risk. So I will, with that, hand it back over.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and I did see from Jim, a comment from Jim, that these slides are slightly different than The ones that were sent out earlier, we will get the most recent or this final set posted to the website as soon as we can after this meeting. And I think for the most part, besides a few adjustments, I think this is the only slide that is new from what was sent out before. So given that current context, we do just wanted to remind everyone that the council is charged with generally ensuring that the siting, construction, and operation of energy facilities is consistent with the protection of public health and safety in the environment. And that is under the siting policy found in ORS 469-310. And then to carry out this mandate, the council has the authority to adopt standards and rules for the siting, construction, and operation of energy facilities as provided in ORS 469-470 and 469-501. As Sarah kind of went over, that latter statute identifies a number of topics that are currently addressed in council standards, and those include protection of public health and safety, and also impacts on public services. And we think that this rulemaking would fall under maybe either one of those categories. As we are moving into the rulemaking process, as Todd mentioned earlier, we are really early in the process, and so we haven't settled on a specific approach or strategy, but we have identified some objectives of what we'd like to accomplish with this rulemaking. Those are that we would like whatever proposed rules we come up with to minimize the risk of a facility subject to the council's jurisdiction, minimize the risk of that facility causing a wildfire. We'd like to ensure that there are adequate protections in place to ensure that public health and safety is protected in the event that there's a fire at a facility, regardless of the cause of ignition. And then finally, to provide some regulatory certainty and consistency to our certificate holders, we do want to maintain consistency with the wildfire mitigation rules adopted by the PUC to the extent possible. So at a minimum, we are trying to avoid any direct conflicts, but really to the extent that we can, we would like our rules to follow a similar approach to what they've been doing. While there are several different ways that can look. Before I move into our more specific policy discussion topics to kind of unpack how we want to meet these objectives, I just wanted to take a second to see if anybody has any questions or would like any clarifications about the scope or context that we're working in right now. Okay, well, seeing none, I'll keep moving on, and as questions or comments pop up, feel free to raise your hand at any time. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we've identified kind of 5 broad areas where we'd like to get feedback from you all during our discussion today. The first is the overall regulatory approach we should take to addressing wildfire risk. The second is the applicability and scope of a council standard or rule. And specifically, we'd kind of like to know what types of facilities the rule should address, because the council's jurisdiction extends past just electric generation facilities and transmission lines. Next, we'd like to talk a little bit about the specific methods and criteria for analyzing wildfire risk at facility sites, and then talk a little bit more about specific preventative actions or programs that may be required or implemented to mitigate risk at energy facilities. So we're going to go through these one by one. I've prepared a brief introduction for each one and then have some questions for you all. If we need to skip around a little bit or something comes up that's out of order, that's okay as well. So we can kind of keep the conversation flowing. But with that, I'll just go ahead and get started on our first topic, which is on the regulatory approach. Okay, so given our objective to maintain consistency with the PUC rules as much as possible, we would like to get some feedback on what you all think the appropriate approach would be to take, regulatory approach would be for the council to take on this. So the PUC rules, and I will look to any PUC staff that wants to correct me if I misstate something, but the PUC rules require electric-owned, investor-owned utilities to operate in compliance with wildfire protection plans. And the requirements for those plans are outlined in the newly established ORS 757963, which was implemented through Senate Bill 762. The standard embedded in both the PUC rules and that statute is that the wildfire protection plans must reflect a reasonable balancing of mitigation costs with resulting reduction in wildfire risk. And I kind of wanted to point this out because while we are mindful that a council rule is not intended to cause unnecessary costs of compliance or administrative burdens on certificate holders, the council really doesn't have the same mandate to consider cost containment or rate recovery as the PUC does. So we are working under slightly different objectives and may need to use a slightly different standard to evaluate compliance with a council rule or standard. Seeing some things moving around. So as we go into this, the approach we've kind of recommended is, or our initial approach that we're thinking of pursuing right now, is to establish a new standard that requires facilities to develop a wildfire risk mitigation plan for the facility. We would kind of like to hear from you all whether you all think that's an appropriate approach, whether there are other approaches we should consider, and whether or not you think that approach would be an effective way of mitigating wildfire risk. We also want to know, if we do go forward with the plan approach, what sort of the appropriate standards or criteria would be to evaluate those plans and to evaluate compliance with the wildfire standard. So with that, I will kind of open this up to discussion and look for any hands raised, or if anybody has any questions or clarification. Okay, well, I am not seeing any hands raised on this, so hopefully we will get some more thoughts going as I go through a little bit more. Okay, and maybe we can move on to the discussion of applicability as folks are chewing on this a little bit. Which is our second question is really related to the types of facilities. So if we do go forward with this idea to require energy facilities to submit a wildfire risk plan as part of their application for site certificate, we want to know whether or not that rule should apply to all energy facilities or a subset of them. The PUC rules do apply just to electric utilities. There is specific rules, as I mentioned, for investor-owned utilities, and then a more general mandate for consumer-owned electric utilities. And the PUC does have other specific safety rules for other types of regulated utilities, but those planning rules only apply to electric transmission lines and potentially also generating assets owned by those investor-owned utilities. The council has a little bit broader jurisdiction, as I mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to throw some examples out there of the things that the council does have jurisdiction over. That includes high voltage transmission lines. Most of those high voltage transmission lines would be owned and operated by the electric utilities. And then we would also be reviewing wind and solar power generation facilities, natural gas power plants, pipelines and storage facilities, and then certain fuel pipelines and production facilities. And the council's jurisdiction is generally determined by the size of facilities. So we would only be reviewing very large facilities that kind of reach a level of statewide concern, but it does cover a broad area. And I just saw a question from Lori about whether or not Oregon Department of Forestry is participating in this rulemaking. Unfortunately, nobody from ODF was available to join the workshop today, but we have been in contact with them and plan on working with them a little bit more closely on some of the risk analysis questions that we have as well. So. Okay, and so does anybody have any thoughts or comments or perspectives on whether or not the council should be looking just at electric power generation facilities, or whether or not we should be looking more broadly at any energy facilities under the council's jurisdiction? Great. And Lori, I'm looking at your comment now saying that the Oregon Department of Forestry sometimes depends on high voltage transmission line corridors as fire breaks. And I think that would be something that would be really good for us to be aware of and in consideration and consider during the siting process. Although I'm not sure if to this point that's been something specifically that we've considered. Oops. And Jem, I see your hand is up, so please go ahead.
Yes, if I may, I just want to go back to the regulatory approach. I'm a slide behind in my thinking, but in looking at the question of is a facility-specific wildfire protection plan an appropriate and effective way to mitigate wildfire risk, I think about fire departments and how would they handle a chemical plant or a production facility or a data center. To my knowledge of some of the firefighters that I know, they have plans preordained for certain facilities, knowing where the pipe stands are, knowing the evacuation routes, electrical supply centers. So I would think looking at best practices at the state fire marshal's office might inform that question as to how to look at your different facilities and anticipate the types of incidents that may occur, and thus work with the local departments for responses.
Thanks, Jim. And look to Sarah if she has anything to add. I know some of our facilities do have specific emergency response plans, and some of the more traditional energy facilities, I think, have, they do have some requirements to maintain an action plan if there is an incident at the facility that explains whether or not there's hazardous materials on site. I know we've worked with some of the facilities that have a battery energy storage system to, give some training to first responders on what they would need to do if there was a fire at the energy system, at the battery system, whether or not it's safe to be opened, what sort of fire suppression it might be equipped with, and what the best way to put out a fire would be. But that's not certainly something I think that's been very consistent across all types of facilities. So I think that's a good comment. Thank you.
I don't have anything to add. I just want to say that what you said was consistent with what I was thinking.
Thanks. Well, I think I often tell this at rulemaking workshops, maybe too often, but one of my favorite professors taught me that the best way to get people to talk, or the best tool to get people to talk, was awkward silences, but that does not seem to be working for me too well today. So we can go ahead and move on and see if there's more discussion as we go through some of these other topics. Oh, well, so one other question that we had on our applicability questions, and maybe I actually need to go through this. I think I missed this slide. Would be whether there are specific factors like geography, zoning, or design that should be considered. And then I think one thing we would like to hear feedback from, and we can get this later if needed too, is if we should be giving special consideration to facilities that are already subject to a PUC wildfire protection plan. And so this would be, whether or not we would be accepting those plans or giving some sort of exemption to the investor-owned, utility-owned and operated transmission lines, particularly, that are already subject to the PUC's requirements. And if anybody does have any thoughts on that now, we'd certainly like to discuss it. But as I'll mention at the end, we're also happy to accept written comments if people have ideas. David?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it doesn't make sense to require duplicative mitigation planning if a utility is already required to provide a comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan through the PUC. So I think we would advocate that there be some deference or incorporation of those pre-existing plans.
And David, I don't know if you can speak to this, and it's okay if you can, but I am curious if the current wildfire protection plans really get down to a facility specific level, or if it's just more general practices that apply to the whole system.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to the mitigation plans that are applicable to, transmission and distribution systems. I imagine the something beyond that isn't currently covered through the PUC, but no, I think they're designed to be a comprehensive plan that applies to a utility's overall system. You're not managing individual lines, but hundreds or even thousands of miles of lines. So that type of coverage, requires a comprehensive planning and not something specific.
Great, thank you.
Oh, well, let me let me add. That's not to say we don't do, mitigation planning, taking into account, risk at certain areas. So I don't want to leave it at that. That doesn't entirely ignore site-specific impacts.
Thanks, and I'll get into this in a second, but I do know, one of the criteria is that there's at least identifications of areas within the utility service area that are subject to heightened levels of risk. So I think we know there is, some geographic specificity there, but I think that's helpful clarification that, these are really general practices that are subject to the whole system. And helps us, kind of refine our thinking about it as well. Jim, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. On the first one, about newly proposed facilities in Oregon or just electric power generation, I think, all facilities should be looked at, but also I think the older facilities should also be looked at and included, because as we look at the power line fires in California, they tended to be older lines, not well maintained. So I think to just do it for new stuff really misses the point of the risk that we are exposed to and our need to mitigate for that. So really the old stuff should almost be first, because the new stuff will probably be built to the best standards.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, and I will say that we definitely want to be careful about proposing anything that's retroactively applicable, and but we will definitely take that into consideration and look at it pretty carefully. Okay, any other comments on this set of questions before we move on to kind of getting into some of the more specific criteria? Okay, so this slide sort of outlines the criteria that was in Senate Bill 762 for those system-wide electric utility plans. I don't think everything is on here, and I do want to note that the PUC rules implementing the bill are a little more detailed than some of the requirements than this. But areas that we thought might be applicable to energy facilities include identification of areas of heightened risk of wildfire, so sort of the risk analysis, identifications of means for mitigating the wildfire risk, preventative actions and programs to minimize risks of facilities causing wildfire, protocols for the de-energization of power lines and adjustments of power line or power system operations, inspection protocols that might be used to address the aging infrastructure and things like that, vegetation management protocols, particularly for transmission line corridors, the development and implementation of administrative costs, which may have less applicability to EFSC facilities than it does to PUC rules, and then community outreach and awareness efforts. I'm going to go through these one by one in a little more detail, particularly the ones we want. But if anytime anybody wants me to come back to this slide, I can. So starting with the means of analyzing risk and identifying areas of heightened risk, I do want to point out that neither the Senate Bill 762 or the PUC rules really prescribe a specific methodology to analyze wildfire risk, but all of the plans that have been submitted do use kind of a similar framework to quantify and assess the level of risk at a given area. In this particular slide was taken from a documentation of methodology used by the Forest Service to do their quantitative wildfire risk assessment, but most wildfire risks assessments kind of use the same framework. At a very high level, this quantifies wildfire risk as a function of both wildfire hazard and resource vulnerability. Wildfire hazard is measured by the probability or likelihood that a fire will occur in a specific area, and then the resulting intensity of that fire if it were to occur. And then the second half of the equation is really the resource vulnerability in the analysis area. And that's also composed of two factors, which are the level of exposure, which is kind of the overall amount of resources that are present in the analysis area, and then the susceptibility of how sensitive those resources are to a fire. And this is, I think, a pretty similar to other risk mitigation frameworks that works, but when you kind of look at the overall hazard or likelihood of something occurring times the consequences of it occurring, you get the overall sense of risk. I think for the council's purposes, we would be interested in seeing what the overall risk is at a energy facility site, and potentially in the area surrounding the site as well, particularly if there's sensitive resources protected by council standards in the immediate area surrounding a site. So as I mentioned, the PUC rules don't have a specific methodology, but I did want to point out that I believe these are the proposed phase 2 rules do contain a little more specific criteria of what should be included. And I thought this would be worth going over as we're kind of thinking about what we would include in our draft rules, as these proposed rules would require the utility to identify the information or the data sources that they chose to use. It would require them to identify the baseline wildfire risk, including topography, vegetation, equipment, and climate, seasonal wildfire risks, risk to residential areas served by the public utility, and then risk to substation or power lines owned by the utility. I'll look to see if I'm misstating any of this. But we wanted to kind of point this out as this is a very utility-centric model. There's also one other resource which we wanted to highlight, which is the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer, which is a mapping tool developed by the Oregon Department of Forestry, and in conjunction with Oregon State, the U.S. Forest Service, and some other folks as well. And we kind of wanted to highlight this because in addition to requiring an analysis of the I guess, vulnerability of both of more human assets. So I think housing and critical infrastructure. This also looks at a broader set of resources like recreation opportunities, timber and agricultural resources, and wildlife and biological resources into the vulnerability analysis, which I think is something that a council rule may be interested in doing, particularly because the council has standards protecting a lot of those assets as well. So I think as we're thinking about what our proposed rules should be, oh, actually, I'll go ahead and stop. Lori, did you have a comment? I think you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we did not specifically identify the Oregon Department of Forestry's risk because the level of detail in that map is not one that was going to work for us. The other thing is that we're not sure they're going to be able to update that map with the frequency that we see the landscape changing. We actually had a recommendation from someone from Oregon Department of Forestry to not call out their map specifically, but we expect that to be in the suite of things that any utility would use to look at their maps. So, I mean, look at their risk. So, you know, we had some input from some of our stakeholders saying, well, why don't you identify this map specifically? And we said, we're not ruling it out, but there are some issues with that mapping tool.
Thanks, Lori. Could you speak, and if not, that's okay, to some of the data sources that you've seen used in the 2022 plans that have been submitted so far?
Oh, I haven't gone through all the plans yet. I've been busy in the other rulemaking, so I need to get on that. So, you know, so we've, I know when we were talking about the rulemaking, and we've got things, you know, the big utilities have their own climatologists, so they're looking at climate change. I think there were some tools specifically from California that were being used as the model, possibly not their data sources, but, you know, I haven't gotten into a detailed examination of their submitted plans yet.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks. Sorry to put you on the spot on that.
No, that's fine. Fair question.
Okay, well, I think that's good comment and good information that, you know, there may be some weaknesses with requiring a specific data source or, you know, requiring specifically use of the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer. I would definitely be interested in hearing from anybody else on the call if there are, you know, specific data sources that we should be looking at, or methodologies, you know, that are well accepted that we should consider. We'd also like to know, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we could be really looking at risks specifically within the site boundary for a facility, or we could be looking at, you know, risks or at least susceptibility to fire damage over a broader area. And then, you know, we'd also like to hear if anybody has any thoughts on kind of the scope of analysis and whether that should be really public health and safety focused, or if we should actually be looking at a broader set of resources. And then the final kind of bullet point here is that we are trying to think about not just the site as it is now or as it is at the time a new facility is proposed, but how that site might change over the life of the facility. And if there's any way that we can really think about how the level of risk at a facility might change, or if this needs to be something that is updated normally, because a lot of our standards, as some folks on this call may know, are really based on getting an approval in at the time of an application. and we don't always have ongoing compliance obligations. So I'll look to see if anybody has any thoughts or comments related to any of these topics. It looks like we have a phone person calling in by phone with a 971-219 number. So please go ahead. And please introduce yourself, thanks.
Sure. This is Brian Fritz with Pacific Core.
Hey,
So I guess I have a couple of questions on these questions, or maybe input. So I would like to know, on the climate change, I mean, how would you do that, considering there's so many different opinions, models? It seems like that would be a pretty tough standard to implement.
Well, right now, I don't know if we have a specific methodology in mind. This could be something as simple as, asking an applicant to propose how fire conditions would change at the site, are expected to change. But I think if the comment is that's not feasible, I think that's definitely something that we should hear.
I would say it's a bit infeasible, and if you're trying to predict the future, my experience is that you're usually wrong. So, and then on the site boundary, it seems like the analysis should be contained within your site boundary.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely consistent with how a lot of our analysis does work. And I don't know if anybody on the call might have ideas about how, risks to assets near a place where a fire might start would be considered in the analysis of, because obviously I don't think an energy facility would be starting a fire outside of its site boundary, but there, could be some spillover effects. So I think that's what we were thinking there. But I also understand that might be beyond what was necessary, perhaps.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Any other thoughts on how we should or should not be yeah, or I guess how we should consider impacts to those resources. So I guess both, changes to a facility over time, or, impacts related to wildfire from a facility that may occur outside of the site boundary. I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts related to any of those issues. Jim?
I'm full of comments today, I guess. Earlier, you had talked about another slide about local zoning. And I'm wondering if a facility is sited close to a residential area, or if, say, you talked about a nacelle catching fire and the prevailing wind directions. I'm wondering if a type of analysis should be done of risk outside of the site boundary, because we also do have civilization encroaching on rural areas, and they could encroach also on your facilities. So I think kind of being somewhat forward thinking of saying, okay, if population grows closer to the facility, what's our contingency plan there? But I also think you need to go look at wind conditions and things like that, because we've seen how fires can quickly grow several miles beyond their starting point. I'm not saying there should be a specific plan yet, but I do think that should be considered at this phase of the rulemaking and not just limit it to the site boundary.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I think that's a good point about zoning. I know one reason we had included that is because we do know that local governments, already have some hazard planning obligations or do some of those activities, and that those efforts are kind of being also being looked at by LCDC now. And so I think one thing we were trying to think about was that, but I think we hadn't thought about looking at surrounding uses and risks of surrounding uses. So thanks for those comments. Okay, hearing nobody else, I'll go ahead and move on to the next kind of topic we wanted to cover, which was preventative actions and programs. These are things that, we could either look at in the context of asking for a plan that proposes preventative actions and programs, and then kind of identifying the things that we would want to see in there, or require to be in there. Or we could, the council could look at establishing separate rules for construction or operation that require specific things to take place. So some of the things that we know are in the PUC rules include public safety power shutoffs, and we definitely would not be looking at the same thing under a council rule, because energy facilities that we regulate do not serve end-use customers. Most of our facilities are serving they are providing power to the bulk transmission grid, or are part of the bulk transmission grid themselves. So we wouldn't necessarily be looking at the same kind of public noticing requirements or the same level of impacts about shutting off customers' powers. But we may want and would like to hear people's feedback on whether or not we should have some requirements for facilities to either shut down or de-energize elements of their facilities under certain high-risk conditions. We definitely are interested in looking at whether or not we should be including specific inspection protocols if there was a facility or facility component cited in a high-risk fire area. And then looking at vegetation management practices, again, in high-risk fire zones, or even generally. And then the last thing that's included in the PUC rules, and we are thinking about how it might apply to our rules, and maybe this is something that relates to Jim's earlier comment, is system hardening. And that is really, looking at existing infrastructure and making it more resistant to fire. And if we're looking at new facilities, I'm not sure how that applies, but if this was to apply to older facilities as well, that may be something we're thinking about incorporating into our process. So again, I'll turn this over to other folks and just see if anybody has any comments on whether there's specific preventative actions or programs that should be required, or how we should evaluate actions or programs proposed by an applicant. Whether we should be looking at specific de-energization protocols, and then whether we should have specific inspection or vegetation management protocols required under our rules or standards as well. And then just generally, if there's anything we're missing here, we'd be interested in hearing if anybody has recommendations for other specific safety devices or design features that are commonly used in generating or non-generating facilities that we should be aware of and considering. And Brian, I see your hand is still raised, which I'm assuming it's still up, but if you do have a comment, go ahead. If not, you can lower your hand by pressing *5 again. Otherwise, I'll look for anybody else that has a comment. Okay, and then I guess while folks are thinking about that, the other things that we are interested in hearing is if anybody has any other ideas on whether we should be looking at any particular land use or development standards. So things like defensible space requirements, which would normally apply to residential areas, but we know that there are some requirements for, say, solar facilities to maintain a defensible space area. Or if we should be looking at specific access standards, if there's specific fire safety codes or construction codes that we should be looking at in the context of energy facility siting. And then going back to what we discussed a little earlier, whether there's specific training needs for emergency responders or other fire protection service providers associated with any specific types of facilities that we should look at, including in a rule or standard of our own. Excuse me, I have a little frog in my throat. But if anybody has any recommendations on any of those things, any of the last two things, we'd definitely be open to hearing any of those specifics. And if not, I'll just go ahead and say that so we will be definitely noting all of the comments that we did hear today and incorporating them into our update and analysis to the council, which should happen in the next few months. In anticipation of that, we're asking anybody on this call or anybody else who would like to provide comments to give us any written comments you wish to provide by March 1st to give us time to get ready to incorporate those into our analysis and go back to council. We were wondering if there was any need for additional workshops or engagement opportunities. If anybody thinks of anybody who should have been included on this call that wasn't, we are happy to set up one-on-one meetings or meet with people in smaller groups or set up another workshop if needed, although I'm not sure if that's the case at this point. Lori, as I mentioned, we are planning on reaching out to ODF and working with them on some of these finer things, and we'll definitely get their input on any issues related to the Wildfire Risk Explorer as well. Yeah, and then if anybody has any other comments just about other persons or groups that may be affected, we'd be open to hearing that as well. We did oh, sorry, and Todd let me know that the sun is in my screen, so I will adjust a little bit. Over here. Actually gonna turn off my camera for a second. Yeah, I guess that is our presentation today. We did schedule this to be going till 6, so I'm gonna leave the meeting on for a second, but I'll turn off the recording here in a minute unless anybody else has any closing comments they'd like to make. So I guess seeing none, thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and look forward to some additional communications and our preliminary analysis and maybe draft proposed rules in the next few months. As we're working on this, feel free, like I said, to provide any written comments by March 1st. You can do that to either this email here or my personal email, which is christopher.clark@energy.oregon.gov. Okay, hopefully the light is a little bit better. Right, and thank you, Lori, for being here.